Over the past several years, people have become increasingly skeptical of information in the mainstream news, and they've turned more and more to alternative news sources who are so frequently referring to the deep state, Zionist bankers, oligarchs, these vague terms that don't put a fine point on exactly who is out there causing these things, making these public policies that are affecting us. I think the past month with the world on lockdown has caused a lot of people to ask some very important questions. And I'm joined today by an excellent journalist by the name of John Martin, who's done a deep dive into Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization. He's joining us today to detail some of the information that's been in the public sphere for a long time, but certainly most Americans have been unaware of it. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have you. You've created a YouTube channel. You've also got a website here called Rough Estimate that includes your article about Dr. Tedros Adhanom, who, I mean, let's face it, this guy is essentially an African warlord, a petty dictator, a Marxist tyrant who has been involved in a regime that imprisons and tortures political opponents, advocates basically shutting down freedom of speech. And now he sits atop the World Health Organization and has had an unbelievable role in dictating the public policy that has shut down the entire planet. John, what can you tell us about this sinister character?
Well, the key thing to understand about Tedros is that he's one of the highest ranking members inside what used to be probably the worst dictatorship in Africa. And so in the last 20 years, Ethiopia imprisoned more journalists than any other country on the planet. And, well, Tedros had a hand in some of that, which I'll get into later. But one thing which is actually very interesting is that Ethiopia recently, the government that Tedros was a representative of, so the dictatorship that he was representing, has now been overthrown by the guy who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, Abiy Ahmed. I don't know if your viewers will have heard of him. But so it's almost a situation as if you had, let's say, a Soviet minister in the late 80s who took over a UN organization, and then the Soviet Union gets overthrown, and his government is gone, but he's still there saying, oh, Soviet Union is a great model, we can all learn from it. So that's what is actually a very bizarre thing about Tedros being in the WHO. The kind of silver lining to it is that once his tenureship is up, he's going to have to return to Ethiopia, and he's not going to be given a warm welcome. Let me tell you that.
Right. So he is a member of, well, he's an ethnic minority. Why don't you tell us a bit about what is it, the Tigray Liberation Front? A lot of these
Tigray
names.
People's Liberation Front. Yeah.
Sorry, give that to us again.
The Tigray People's Liberation Front.
Right. And a lot of these names are going to be complicated for people to remember. So that's part of the reason why we want to go over this. It's important information to people to remember, and hopefully it's going to have an impact on closing down some of these draconian policies before it's too late. I remain hopeful that it is not yet too late. So who exactly are the Tigray, and what is the Tigray People's Liberation Front, and Dr. Tedros' role there?
Right. So before I continue, I want to point out that many Ethiopian people over the last couple of weeks have contacted me and filled me in on where I was lacking. And I'm actually relying on actual journalists in Ethiopia, many of whom have been exiled, who did a lot of this original reporting, specifically a guy called Abebe Galore. He's a visiting scholar at Stanford. He's written for The Guardian. So he's actually kind of the most important person in this reporting. And I've just compiled a lot of what he wrote. So I'd like to credit him. I've tried contacting him, haven't got anything back, but I want to make sure I credit him before I continue.
Give me that name again, and we'll see if we can find him online.
Abebe Galore. That's Abebe. Next word, Gellaw. And he was exiled in 2011 because he was an opposition, opposed the government. And so he was kicked out of the country. Most of his friends are either killed or in prison. And he's now an asylum seeker in the UK, I believe.
Mm. So I've got a document here from the Stanford Center on Democracy and the Development and Rule of Law, which seems to be talking about Mr. Abibi, who you've been in communication with. This is the right guy, right?
Yes, that's him.
Okay.
Yeah,
So that's interesting.
worth checking out his worth checking out his Oslo Freedom Prize speech that he gave in I want to say 2011, around that time.
See, this is important, I think, for people to become familiar with some of these journalists who perhaps we haven't heard from. In your video report that people can see on your YouTube channel, people can search for John Martin on YouTube, and in the event they have any difficulty finding that, I'm going to, right now, just paste a link to your YouTube channel into the comments so people watching this video right now will be able to get to it. And isn't it correct, John, that Dr. Tedros and the Tigray People's Liberation Party, they imprison journalists like Abibi. They've reported torture, including rape, right?
Yep. Yeah. So I want to make it clear the kind of government that Tedros belonged to, that he was actually, in a sense, the PR man for. So they took over from another dictator, someone called Mengistu, led a regime called the Derg in the 70s, when Ethiopia was fully communist. So another thing important to understand is that Ethiopia has these links with China because it was a communist regime back in the 70s. And so the TPLF were effectively a fighting front organized along Maoist lines. They're inspired by Mao's insurgency. And so you had, in the 90s, a communist party overthrowing an incumbent communist government. And it's after this change of power, which Tedros then kind of works his way up within the regime.
Mm-hmm. And in addition to being the health minister of Ethiopia, which, by the way, is not exactly world-renowned for its outstanding public health, Charles Ortel has told us extensively about the lack of clean water, the lack of hospitals. Growing up as a child in the 1980s, I still have very clear memories of the famine that was going on in Ethiopia. And Dr. Tedros was the third in command as the, what was his role? He was the minister?
Well, he was Minister of Health. He was director of the health ministry at a time when the government was orchestrated in a campaign to use the famine as basically a counterinsurgency strategy to deny food and medical assistance for opponents of the government. So this is from a report issued by Human Rights Watch 2005, that they would send the army to villages, and if the people there were found to have voted for or be supportive of an opposition party, they'd be denied food, children would be denied medical treatment if their parents were found to be opposition supporters. And you had gangs that would go to these villages, kill a bunch of people, rape their women. Again, similar reports by Human Rights Watch. And the health ministry that was doing this was being led by Tedros Adhanom.
Mm-hmm. So these aren't hollow accusations. These aren't vague statements. These are very specific actions that have been taken by Tedros Adhanom and the political affiliates he's been aligned with for many years. How did this guy come to be the head of the World Health Organization? Who appoints that position?
Yeah, so this is something I was going to get into later, but I'll just go through it now. Important to point out, we can't know for sure, but I'll sketch out what I think is the most likely explanation. So it used to be in the World Health Organization that the way the director is appointed was by something called the Executive Committee. And so they were appointed by heads of states, health ministers. And then they changed that in 2015 because it was too secretive. They changed it so that it was the heads of the health ministers that they would directly appoint a leader. And a few weeks before the vote, the African Union unanimously supported Tedros, which guaranteed him about 54 votes, and that pushed him over the line.
Wow.
And so what's important to understand here is that the African Union, the parliament, was built by Chinese companies with the Chinese government's assistance. They're funded by the Chinese government to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And it was found later that the Chinese government actually built in surveillance to the African Union so that they could use political leverage to manipulate them. And China has no qualms about using bribery and manipulation in general in Africa. There's been reports that they even bribed the president of Chad, the they promoted their other candidates in the United Nations by threatening African Union states. And so, to my mind, it's fairly obvious that if they'd wanted to, they could have used their influence in the African Parliament to have guaranteed Tedros the vote. I think there's other things that could possibly explain how he was elected, but for me, that's slight speculative, I know, but that's the most convincing explanation.
Mm-hmm. And the thing that's always interesting for me with regard to this channel, Crowdsource the Truth, when you mention something like the African Union, I immediately begin to think about stories that we've heard from Jimmy and Joanne Moriarty, who were actually in Libya in 2007 through 2011. They've told us how Gaddafi, as the leader of the African Union, introduced an actual gold currency, the gold African dinar, which was intended to challenge the dollar and the euro on the world stage and be the only currency for oil trading in Africa. I think most people know what happened to Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, and I wonder to what extent the new administration of the African Union was perhaps more complicit with this globalist agenda than Mr. Gaddafi.
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't know about Gaddafi's introduction there. That's very interesting. But I suppose another thing that feeds into this is that China has so much influence over African governments individually that, as well as their influence in the Union. So, like I said in the video, they've poured, again, hundreds of billions of investments into Ethiopia, into their roads, into their transport industry. They even built a kind of propaganda security center for them. So Ethiopia, until very recently, was had totally state-controlled media. It owned every TV channel, every radio station, was all owned by the government. This was a government that was supposed to hold elections after it came to power in the late 90s, but refused to. The first time it tried holding an election in 2005, the Zenawi, the dictator who controlled it, when it became clear that he wouldn't win, he cancelled the elections and declared himself the victor. Obviously, many people weren't very happy about this, and so people came on the street and protested, and the police opened fire with live ammunition, led to 200 people dead and 40,000 people imprisoned. And you have to go back very far in African history to, for example, like 1980 South Africa, to find a regime that has imprisoned that many people.
Wow. I mean, what you're describing is absolute totalitarianism. We perhaps on this broadcast have yet mentioned that the Tigray People's Liberation Front, they're Marxist, communists, they're totally into all the things that you're talking about. And they've infiltrated through Dr. Tedros this organization that sits atop every nation in the world, has virtually no oversight, a very secretive nomination process for their director. And Dr. Tedros has been issuing information and making declarations that sort of seem to enable world leaders like Donald Trump and others to institute these policies that have now trickled down to affect the lives of almost every single person on Earth. Now, I want to apologize because you've prepared a document for me here that's sort of in order, and I've been taking you all over the place. Should we start at the top of the document and go through it?
We can do. I mean, I'm happy to talk about whatever, but yeah, I'll go through this. So yeah, so in terms of Tedros's listing or his influence in the TPLA, this is Tigray Online. They list him as, I believe, is it the 6th highest member? And there's another newspaper, the Ethiopian Herald, which lists him as the 3rd. Because this is the Tigray website, I would go with this one. So 6th, 3rd, 4th, depending on who you ask. But anyway, you get the point. It's very important within this party.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, I just want to mention that in terms of him being a communist, it's a little bit complicated because after they overthrow the communist dictatorship, they are themselves a communist party, and they kind of, a little bit like China, they kind of get rid of the ideology. So they kind of embrace free markets to an extent, but they keep the communist government structure. So if you compare China and Ethiopia, there's a lot of similarities over the last 10 years. So the fact that they will accept foreign investment, but then use it to enact these totally totalitarian measures. For example, the 15,000 people that were relocated off their land in the Aroma region, which led to this massive crisis in 2016. that was purely so that an Indian company that was manufacturing pharma equipment could build infrastructure there. So a big aspect of this is that you have an alliance between dictatorships and massive corporations that are happy to fund them.
That's very interesting because, you know, we've heard Dr. Tedros in speeches that he's given at the UN and elsewhere talking quite a bit about these public-private partnerships. And I have to tell you, John, when I hear that specific language, it sets off a little light bulb above my head, because we've heard that same exact phraseology used by Bill Gates, by Bill Clinton. These are the American oligarchs who sit atop these huge NGOs, these foundations that Charles Ortel has spent the past several years detailing extensive evidence from the filings of these organizations themselves, the foundation's official filings, IRS documents that are publicly available here in the United States. Charles Ortel contends that these organizations have been involved in redirection of funds, money laundering, tax evasion, certainly in the case of the Clinton Foundation and their association with Ranbaxy, the corrupt Indian pharmaceutical company whose two principals, the Singh brothers, I believe remain incarcerated in India. There's been almost no reporting on this in the United States at all, and it's quite a problem because this is a company that was trusted and sold to the people who were making financial contributions to the Clinton Foundation as an honorable pharmaceutical company that intended to help the underprivileged in Africa with HIV and AIDS drugs, but it was actually later determined by, you know, credible sources, and this was written about in Fortune magazine, that the drugs provided by Ranbaxy had not been properly tested. Their efficacy against HIV and AIDS was never proven, and the results were absolutely falsified. This is not the only instance of a situation like this where medical facts, research, and details were covered or misrepresented entirely in order to effect a change in public policy. Your really insightful and beautifully done video that people can see on your YouTube channel, you go into some detail about how, as the Ethiopian health minister, Dr. Tedros was able to manipulate certain, it was a cholera outbreak, was it? Tell us about that segment.
Yeah, so when he was health minister, I believe this is around 2008, around that time, you had a cholera outbreak in the east of Africa, so it affected places like Somalia, Yemen, and the Ethiopian government's strategy, and this is sort of classic communist governments, is what they do. He just renamed the disease to acute watery diarrhea, or AWD, so that on paper, all these countries in the area had a cholera outbreak except for Ethiopia. And even though you had UN doctors going in and testing people and finding that it was cholera, the Ethiopian government put pressure on their own employees and other organizations to not call it cholera, despite the fact that you had an even worse outbreak in Ethiopia. And I believe this happened even 3 separate times. So that's his legacy as health minister.
Right. And again, I mean, it's an interesting point to raise, and this is the entire purpose of Crowdsource the Truth. You're there doing your research, and you can't possibly know every detail about everything, but Charles Ortel has spoken quite extensively, and even mockingly, fair enough, about Chelsea Clinton and what Business Insider in March of 2014 described as her obsession with diarrhea. It sounds ridiculous because of what we're talking about, but if you're living in a country like Ethiopia that doesn't have clean water, doesn't have the appropriate hospital infrastructure, doesn't even have simple medications, this is a deadly condition that people can become dehydrated from and easily die. This article tells us that things got really real when Chelsea Clinton participated in a question and answer session at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. Interestingly, that was canceled, one of the first events to be canceled by this outbreak of COVID-19, I wonder if Chelsea Clinton's dissertation on this topic in any way played into Dr. Tedros's reclassification of the condition. I'm making this connection because it seems like there are a lot of connections between these people that until we draw attention to them, are very easily missed. Were you aware of this aspect of Chelsea Clinton's research?
Well, people have sent me things talking about the role of the Clinton Foundation, also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Ethiopia, because I believe they both did a fair bit of charitable work in Ethiopia, again, because it had this history of famine. Well, and not only that, but Ethiopia was, although it was a communist country, it was supposedly open to business enterprises. So the reason Tedros brags about all these improvements on his CV, actually what was happening is that foreign companies were allowed to go into Ethiopia and basically use it as their way to enact pet projects that Tedros would oversee. And so that's kind of what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Clinton Foundation, I believe, were doing to an extent. As for how closely they work together, I really don't know the extent of it. Until more information comes out, I don't want to comment too much on it. I know he met Tedros in 2014, so when he was foreign minister, so clearly the relationship went back further than that. Yes, and as you can see, he was very happy to endorse him and talk him up after he was elected. So I think at the very least, you can accuse someone like Bill Gates of being very naive and willing to look the other way about what a very repressive dictatorship was doing in Africa.
I think you're more diplomatic than I am. There's a lot of evidence to indicate that Bill Gates has supported Dr. Tedros, the World Health Organization, certainly the Clinton Foundation, certainly bad science related to vaccines and the deployment of vaccines in third world and underprivileged countries. So just back to your video and your research on Dr. Tedros. Forgive me for constantly derailing the conversation, but where would you like to take us next?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to explore this idea that, well, let's say Bill Gates, for example. I suppose it's more, if we're talking about collaboration, it's more like certain people seeing things a certain way. So I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that it's not just these organizations like Bill Gates or the Clinton Foundation, but it was actually world governments that were very happy to ally themselves with the Ethiopian dictatorship during the 2000s. And that's because the dictator, Zenawi, he effectively painted himself as an ally to the United States and the West in the war on terror. So he made himself out to be tough on terrorism. And he actually invaded Somalia with United States backing in 2006, something I didn't know about. And again, he basically used this as a pretext to strengthen his own power in his own country. He bombed his own country as an excuse to continuing the war with Eritrea. Tedros is actually Eritrean, by the way. He's born in what used to be Ethiopia, but is now Eritrea. And so when Zenawi died in 2012, you had Obama, David Cameron, Bill Gates, all said that he was an amazing leader who was loved by his people, which is kind of an odd thing to say about the most repressive regime in Africa, a government that did not allow elections, even though it was supposed to. And it's again the same kind of thing you had when Castro died, but it's kind of a belief. I suppose the way they would see it was that you had this regime that, yes, it was a dictatorship, but it was open to foreign investment, and if we were nice to it, if foreign companies were sort of they could negotiate with it, that maybe it could be sort of co-opted. And I think that is the way that a lot of these foreign interests and foreign companies, that's the way they see this. And it's interestingly the same way they look at China. They think we can put we can get a influence in China by getting our foreign companies there, making them open to free trade. But the same thing that happened in Ethiopia happened in China, is that all that happens is that these dictatorships will they're happy to use Western companies to strengthen their dictatorship.
And there's an important detail that we forgot to mention about the Tigray People's Liberation Front. It's been classified as a terrorist organization by the United States, and it's still classified as a terrorist organization, isn't it? Can you give us some details on that?
Yeah, so this is, I want to clear some things up, because people, after watching the video, said things like, Tedros is a terrorist, and it's like, when they were carrying out the bulk of their assassinations and bombing campaigns, that was when they were an armed insurgency against the dictatorship. So that is somewhat, understandable. But then later, when they were actually in power, they would, and again, Human Rights Watch has reported on this, they would send the army into these minority regions to just basically repress, kill, take people away from the villages, and kill them in the rural areas that it wasn't noticed. And this happened multiple times, and that's why they're still listed by the Global Terrorism Database as a terrorist organization.
It's a pretty interesting piece of information for people to know that somebody who is even remotely associated with a group that's listed as a global terrorist organization is now the head of the World Health Organization and dictating policy that is affecting our lives here in the United States. I don't know if you have seen this video, but it was quite shocking to see a man pulled off a SEPTA bus. SEPTA is the mass transit authority in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. This individual was just basically ejected from the bus for not wearing a face mask. Now, this is quite shocking to people in the United States. I think it should also be noted that these are mostly white police officers removing a gentleman who appears to be black from the bus. This is a shocking thing for me to see and a scary harbinger of what may be to come. And we're going to watch this, and we see several individuals physically tugging at this man. His mobile phone drops to the ground, is stepped on by the police. His property is thrown about. He's physically abused. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 armed officers physically removing this guy from the bus. Not all of them are wearing medical masks. And there's another video out of Philadelphia yesterday where a guy on the bus is throwing people off for not wearing masks, and the guy himself is not wearing a mask. I'm asking you to speculate here, but can we expect this type of communist, Marxist, totalitarianism to infiltrate our lives here in the United States and in other Western countries now that we're being sort of ruled over by policies from Dr. Tedros?
Well, I mean, I suppose you're lucky enough to have a leader who is somewhat skeptical about these institutions, and I suppose because of there's been enough reporting at this point where people understand the risks. But yeah, at least early on in the pandemic, the fact that you had someone like him basically advising the world governments all about what they should do in response to this pandemic, and who did nothing but praise the leadership of China when it was obvious from day one that they were covering up the numbers. I mean, I was in China when it broke out, so kind of, I mean,
really?
No, yeah, I've been living in China until very recently, so we knew straight away because they didn't report on it until it actually reached Japan and Germany. They didn't even mention that it was a virus that was potentially dangerous to the public, and so we knew from day one that the figures were covered up. But I mean, Tedros spent his entire tenure, still carries on praising them.
Wow.
And so, in terms of it being enacted by, I suppose the real question is what our relationship should now be with, for example, the World Trade Organization and the United Nations. What should we do about it? Because, I mean, this is another point I want to mention that just recently, last year, the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is another branch of the UN, the Chinese got their candidate to be the leader by bribing other African states to withdraw their candidates. And this is reported by Foreign Policy. It's somewhere in the document I sent you. And so China, they're not playing by the same rules that we are. They're perfectly happy to use bribery and threats and intimidation to get their people in the UN and in the World Trade Organization.
Wow.
And so the question is, what do we do about that? Because, for example, let's say you imposed restrictions and said that you can only hold a UN position if you meet these requirements. Let's say because the problem with the UN and any global organization is that most countries in the world are fairly corrupt. Most third world countries, they've got imperfect institutions. I'm not saying our institution's perfect, far from it, but they're at least less susceptible to bribery from more powerful states, which is what China is doing. And so if you just go around kicking countries out, that kind of defeats the whole point of the UN, for example.
Right.
And let's say Trump is now talking about defunding the World Trade Organization. Totally understandable, but if you do that, you effectively give it all to China. So one wonders if you couldn't have a sort of an anti-corruption campaign inside its institutions. The World Trade Organization may be a lost cause because it seems to be totally subverted. But let's say the wider UN in general, I wonder if there might be a kind of call for an anti-corruption campaign by the member states that are within it, and especially if the European Union states were to support the US in that, which I kind of think they see which way the wind's blowing at the moment.
And certainly China has been making huge investments in Africa, rare earth minerals and various things that are used to manufacture batteries and some of the high-tech products that people all over the Western world enjoy. I don't know that people necessarily appreciate how far-reaching the impact is when Donald Trump speaks about trade imbalances with China and the economic strength that China has accumulated. Some of these details perhaps are lost, and now that everybody is trapped in their home, fearful of this allegedly deadly virus, maybe there's a new understanding for what the President of the United States was talking about when he said he wanted to be harder on China. People that watch Crowdsource the Truth are generally quite skeptical of the United Nations. I don't know if there are viewers who are with us right now who are perhaps unaware, but the land upon which the United Nations is built was donated by the Rockefeller family.
Yeah, I remember hearing a lot about this stuff. I mean, I suppose there was a time when, let's say, the political left were very skeptical of global institutions, especially the 1990s. I don't know if maybe you're more aware of this than me because it happened in the United States, but there were massive protests in Seattle about the creation of the World Trade Organization, for example, in the 90s, and the influence that the United Nations was having over the world, because it was seen as an extension of imperialism. And it just so happens that, well, in my lifetime in particular, the 2000s, 2010s, we saw this kind of merging between global institutions like the UN and corporate interest. And there's a journalist called Sonia Shan. She's written about this for Foreign Policy, that the World Trade Organization, sorry, the World Health Organization in particular, changed its funding rules in the 1990s so that companies could donate as much money as they wanted into them. And in some way, that's good. You want these. That means they can fund health programs. They did do a lot of good in the world, not denying it. But what that means is that they're unaccountable. I mean, at least in theory, if your government is appointing people to the United Nations or the World Health, or WHO, you can hold them accountable a little bit. But if it's completely run by companies, you can't hold them accountable. You can't, like, no one can tell Bill Gates to stop having his influence in the World Health Organization. Like, he's the biggest funder of the WHO. At least the only bigger funder is the United States government, and he gets a lot more from his money than the US government is. So, he basically talks about it like he owns the place. He's like, here's our strategy. Here's what we're going to do. It's like, come on, who appointed him the leader of it?
It's an excellent question, and it takes me back to this public-private partnership issue. Other guests on Crowdsource the Truth, including David Hawkins, most specifically David Hawkins, have spoken about international conglomerates like Serco, which is a corporation to which a lot of government function gets outsourced. And the danger is, once government functions are outsourced to private corporations like Serco, controlling the corporation amounts to just purchasing the stock. And if the corporation controls functions of government, then multi-billionaires like Bill Gates can easily purchase government influence and actually control policy. So this is what I'm getting at, John, because it seems to me that when I look at the really strong evidence that you've presented of Dr. Tedros and his truly despicable past, his behavior, and the draconian policies that his public health policy has enabled, you can't help but question the close relationship of Bill Gates. I mean, how could someone stand smiling with an individual who has reclassified diseases to prevent food and medication from reaching sick children? This is something that Bill Gates should be expected to know. I mean, we've seen a lot of photographs of these two together looking really very happy. Obviously, they're at various ages, taken a few years apart. So seems like they've had a long-standing and mutually beneficial relationship. A lot of people have also spoken about the World Health Organization being China-centric and pro-China, and you're talking to us about the influence that China has throughout Africa and the World Health Organization. To what extent can we control the degree to which China is dictating U.S. policy? A lot of people, including the president, seem to think COVID-19 came from China to the United States.
Well, I mean, this is kind of the most important question in a way, because it's I suppose on a global scale, the problem that many of us in Europe have with the European Union, which has many of the same problems as every other global organization, is that the people who run it are an appointee of an appointee of an appointee, and so you by the time you get to the people actually running the organization, like, you're not voting for them, you're voting for whoever's in your local area or in your country who you agree with or disagree with, and you don't really care too much about who the health minister is. I mean, that's a minor detail, and so for me, the point isn't so much that Bill Gates is doing these things, because he does a lot of philanthropy. He does a lot of good work in the world, but the point is that he's not accountable. Let's say let's say you love Bill Gates, or people really agree with what he's doing, but let's say people don't. They can't vote him out. There's no way to remove his influence. So I think that's the key thing to take away from it. And as for what we can do about it, yeah, like I said, it depends on which part of the UN, because you'd sort of want to reform it to make it more parliamentary. Like, you sort of wonder if, let's say, you could just have a vote in the whole world about, let's say, here's Tedros and here's someone else, like David Navarro, the other candidate who is going to head the World Health Organization. If you could just have a global vote, like, who do you want? You would maybe have, some support for Tedros, but probably, most of the world would vote for the other guy, especially after what has happened. So I wonder if there's a case for almost having, like, direct votes for people in these institutions. That could be a good way to reform them, because we really need to be having a conversation about how to reform every global institution, because it seems the current system we have is clearly not working.
Right. I think it was Peter Navarro. Is that the guy that we're talking about?
Sorry, yes. Yeah, Peter Navarro.
Dave Navarro is like the Red Hot Chili Peppers or something.
No, sorry. David Navarro was the other candidate. He's a British doctor who was the other candidate for WHO.
Ah, okay.
Right,
so that's somebody that I didn't know. No, you may be right. I didn't know. I just Googled Dave Navarro and I got, like, the musician. See,
I was just using him as an example for, like, if you could actually have a direct democratic system for the institutions, that could be a way to reform them. But that's just an idea.
Well, it's just interesting to look at how all these things came about in the first place. So we see that Rockefeller creates this, United Nations. Sounds great. We're going to unite all the nations. We're going to do all this stuff for human rights and helping people and philanthropy and whatnot. But when you actually dig into it, and when we see now where the world is today, total lockdown of the people, the economy, it's a psychological lockdown, isn't it, John? People are literally afraid to leave their houses, to stand near other people. They're walking around in these medical masks with rubber gloves. The notion of going to a friend's house or meeting new people, I mean, we're straight up being told, don't hang around with other people. In Philadelphia, you can now be pulled off a bus and arrested. That guy was essentially beaten. This is a scary thing for people to witness. Those of us who live in ostensibly free countries, our entire country has been turned upside down. The Constitution has been cast aside in a remarkably short period of time. And it all seems that it can be quite directly tied to this tyrant and his corporate supporters who have placed him in power.
Well, yeah, I mean, the other worrying thing is, of course, that you had the WHO advising tech companies on how to censor articles and YouTube videos that were spreading disinformation. And
that's right.
Well, to question China's official statistics is not, the Chinese government itself is spreading disinformation. Every statistic they publish is disinformation. And so, I believe they've kind of stopped doing that a little bit. It seems that way. But at least that was the initial response. And so you really did have, at least in the early days, you had governments basically taking the lead of the WHO. And I don't know what it's like in the US. Do you guys, are you under proper quarantine or not? Are you allowed to sort of go outside and stuff?
It varies from state to state. In New York, there have been guidelines issued where if you are a non-essential worker, you are supposed to stay home. I have interacted with the police quite extensively in my various walks around New York City, where I've been observing, some of the changes that have set in rather rapidly. And, the police, the NYPD, have asked me questions like, why are you here? What's your job? Are you essential? You're not wearing a mask. You weren't standing 6 feet away from that person. Sort of suggesting that if they wanted to, they could beat me down to the sidewalk and drag me into jail and let me try to find a lawyer. But they've stopped short of doing exactly that. People who watched my visit to the USNS Comfort, the Navy hospital ship that was brought here to New York. I went there just the other day because I had seen a documentary that said that despite the fact that these Navy vessels were brought here to serve medical needs for people who did not have coronavirus, when I saw this documentary, it said that the ships were incapable of conducting open heart surgery. And given that heart disease is the #1 cause of death in the United States, I thought it was a pretty gross misuse of resources to bring in a hospital that can't address that function. So I went to ask someone, and I asked these U.S. Marines if there was a commanding officer I could speak to. This guy, I think, is a Sergeant Mauser, or however you pronounce that name. He obviously is a very sloppy Marine. His personal protection equipment is not properly applied. I think that's a big no-no in the military. You're supposed to be properly suited up. And it's my opinion that anyone who is enforcing the law should do so first by example. This guy refused to answer my questions, basically treated me like a bully would, and walked away without telling me exactly what he was doing. I suspect he intended to call NYPD and tell them something to the effect of, this guy's not standing 6 feet away, come and, get him the hell out of here, or whatever it is he might have said. But I was frankly disgusted by the behavior of that Marine, and I consider those people at Pier 90 to be an invading force here in the city of New York. I'm a citizen who's concerned about what's going on, and they were not prepared to answer questions. I recognize that, low-level members of the military may not be authorized to do that, but it's my personal opinion that they should be prepared with a script to speak to the public and the press and explain to them who they can get answers from. That wise guy told me to Google public affairs, which of course is far too vague. John, I want to share with you this, just a segment of this speech that Dr. Tedros gave recently at, I believe this was, where was this speech? This is in Switzerland. So this is the director of the World Health Organization. Let's listen to this for a moment.
Another public health emergency of international concern, this time over the outbreak of novel coronavirus. As of this morning, there are 17,000.
Sorry, is it still going on? I can't hear you at the moment. Sound's gone. I don't know what's happened. I can hear the video okay, just now. Can you hear me?
Hang on just a second. We've had a little technical problem. It's interesting how this sometimes occurs. I've come up with a backup strategy. Give me a moment and we'll get that back online. But very, very interesting to see how when we play video like that, there seem to be these strange problems. I can frequently do shows for hours at a time without having any kind of technical issues like that. But just vamping for a moment here while we get that system back online.
Well, I can hear you now, just not the video.
Yeah.
Did.
Yeah, the audio quality is going to be a bit strange until we get that back up and running. But what Dr. Tedros says in that piece, he emphasizes the need for these public-private partnerships. And I wanted to bring our conversation around. If Dr. Tedros has a history of manipulating medical data and reclassifying a cholera outbreak to achieve a political goal, what confidence do we have that he's not doing exactly that in the case of COVID-19?
That's an important point. I mean, something I want to mention is that the first thing that Tedros did when he was elected Director General was to give a speech calling for more openness in the World Health Organization. And immediately after that, he passed legislation allowing the WHO to basically fund itself more, give itself more money in a way that couldn't be traced by anybody, where the money was not allocated to specific things. And remember that around the same time, you had this scandal where the World Health Organization was found to have spent nearly $200 billion a year on travel expenses, which is more than their entire AIDS budget. Yeah, see, 192, I believe.
Now, wait a minute.
Around that.
That's a critical thing that you've just raised, because this is the exact same tactic that Charles Ortel has told us was utilized by the Clinton Foundation. So this is what I'm talking about. We're not talking about some vague Khazarian mafia. We're not talking about the Zionists. We're not talking about Saudi Arabia. We're not talking about them. We're talking about the Clinton Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Health Organization, and the corporation Serco. That's who I'm talking about. I think that if those entities were properly investigated and the relationships between them were understood, I mean, the evidence is basically laid bare here. We can see what's going on. I don't know if we want to attempt to play that Dr. Tedros video again, but if people look for it, it's pretty easy to find. And, you know, John, I know you're very busy. I don't imagine you've had time to watch the videos that I've been making moving around New York City. But it seems that the evidence... Sorry?
I watched a couple.
Yeah, the evidence that I'm finding on the ground does not seem to support the claims that are being made in the news. Just yesterday, the BBC was reporting mass graves being dug in New York City, but what they failed to tell people who saw this shocking news is that Hart Island has, for many, many years, been used to bury the remains of indigent and unknown individuals. Rikers Island prisoners do that. This story was certainly, at very least, misrepresented to cause people to think that these were the overflowing massive daily deaths caused by coronavirus. I've also personally identified a number of doctors who, like Dr. Tedros, seem perhaps to be not dedicated to the truth, but rather to social engineering campaigns. Is that a term that you're familiar with, John, social engineering?
I am, although it's often used quite vaguely. So, I need to hear an example. But for the BBC, the BBC has been one of the worst media outlets in covering the coronavirus from pretty much the first instance. I remember they were, when the first whistleblowers came out in China, nurses trying to warn the public that the death count was far higher, they were trying to discredit them and saying that, oh, they're not dressed properly, basically repeating the Chinese government propaganda against them. And keep in mind that if you're a Chinese nurse who's trying to contact foreign journalists or go against the party line, you're at risk of spending the rest of your life in prison for that. But the BBC were taking the side of the party. I actually got into an argument with a BBC journalist, name's Stephen, forgotten, it's Stephen something. But he was the lead journalist who was reporting on the coronavirus in Beijing, and he said that there's no reason to not believe the Chinese government's figures. I mean, wow. This is what this guy was saying.
I mean, do you think he can possibly believe that, or has he somehow been influenced to cause other people to believe that?
Well, this is a good question, because if you're a real journalist in China at all, you're basically not allowed to cover many things. It's very hard to get a license to do it. And you basically have to toe the party line completely. Mm-hmm. So that either means that he's unable to say anything that goes against what the party wants him to say, or that he's just co-opted and that he agrees with their philosophy. I mean, I don't accuse anybody of being ideologically aligned with the CCP without evidence, but effectively it amounts to the same thing.
But we do have extensive evidence that the BBC has protected prominent pedophiles, including Jimmy Savile, Jill Dando, who was a BBC journalist conducting an investigative report into the activity of Jimmy Savile and other pedophiles, was murdered, and the case remains unsolved. There was a huge public outcry in the United Kingdom about this. really disgusting statue of Prospero and Ariel, which appears to be a naked man penetrating a young boy from the rear, who is reacting sort of with a combination of shock and glee. There was a public outcry demanding the removal of this, particularly since the sculptor, Eric Gill, was himself a rapist and pedophile who had sexual intercourse with his own daughters. Truly a despicable, disgusting character. There's a long history of pedophilia associated with the BBC and certain politicians. Some would even argue that Jeffrey Epstein and the pedophile ring that he was involved with is an extension of this. I think most people also know that Jimmy Savile was a close friend of Prince Charles, frequently seen pictured with members of the royal family. There have even been stories told that Jimmy Savile was brought in as a marriage counselor when Charles and Diana were having some problems. It was only after his death that it was revealed that Jimmy Savile was perhaps the most prolific pedophile and necrophiliac known in modern history. This is all information I presume you're aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when the news first broke, and well, the BBC didn't even really report on it that much when it could no longer be denied, and so yeah, he kind of hosted one of their biggest shows for such a long time. So, I mean, it's the problem with state-funded media, really. The BBC is just an extension of the establishment of the government. I didn't know about that sculpture though. Where is that? Is that in London? The one that you showed?
Yeah, the sculpture is literally right outside BBC's headquarters at the Broadcasting House, right across the street from the Langham Hotel, right there in London. David Hawkins and I were there, I think it was earlier this year or just towards the end of 2019. The Langham Hotel has a very storied history. I believe it had the first telegraph or radio room in London, and many believe it acted as sort of the shadow BBC headquarters when BBC headquarters was bombed during World War II. Lots of strange espionage connections. Of course, George Orwell worked for the BBC. There is a statue of George Orwell right underneath this there's a walkway over here that's not too visible on Google Earth, but there's a statue of George Orwell under there, author, of course, of 1984, the novel that depicted a dystopian future in which a totalitarian government ruled over us, instructing everyone to listen and obey. As this statue on the other side of the BBC tells us, this Latin phrase, absculta, instructs viewers to listen and obey, at the same time that it depicts what appears to be a naked, crucified Christ being accosted by these, I guess, angels. This is another bizarre Eric Gill sculpture that I think is really telling us quite a lot about the BBC. This is not an organization that I hold in any kind of high regard, but they also seem to be involved in the spreading of this disinformation, misinformation. This is a social engineering campaign, causing the public to believe something to be true, which in fact is not. The thing that's so confusing about this Hart Island story is that it is true that this is a mass grave, certainly burying more than one person and burying, 20 or so that we see right here is accurately described as a mass grave. It does not go into the details of telling you that this is a normal practice for burying homeless people and that these individuals, there's no clear identification that these people have died of coronavirus. We've also heard from the BBC, the New York Times, and others that New York City is the epicenter of this COVID-19 outbreak in New York City. When I've interviewed some of the doctors that have been covered in these stories, they refuse to answer simple questions. Most notably, and this is a story that went around the world, the New York Times had a story about a doctor, a medical doctor. This is an emergency room specialist who has a New York State medical license in good standing. Many people have been spreading the false rumor that Dr. Colleen Smith is not, in fact, a doctor. This is incorrect. She is a doctor. She's also a self-proclaimed simulation enthusiast, and she's given a number of lectures on simulating trauma. I think certainly people who are around the world seeing stories from the BBC and others depicting mass death and fearing for their own lives and those of their family members are being traumatized. And when I asked Dr. Colleen Smith certain very specific questions, for instance, the New York Times announced 10 days ago that Dr. Smith had tested positive for COVID-19. I tried to ask her if she would continue seeing patients in the hospital despite this positive diagnosis and the mild symptoms described in the New York Times. She refused to answer. The hospital refused to answer. The hospital refused to answer about their official policy of doctors recording video and audio inside the ICU or the ER. They would not answer that. Medical doctors who I have spoken to have said that this is strictly against policy, if not against the law. Dr. Smith in this video made a really big point out of what she described as the lack of mechanical ventilators. We've heard a lot about this. The New York Times story goes on to tell us that the hospital itself denies Dr. Colleen Smith's claim. The hospital says there was never a moment that they were close to running out of ventilators. And there was this whole push and pull between the governor of New York and this story as to whether there were or were not ventilators. We've since seen another doctor come out talking about ventilators, and we've also learned that when patients are admitted to the hospital, we've got to look up the circumstances, but there's a $13,000 payment from Medicare or Medicaid or whatever that is, and if the patient gets ventilated, that per patient payout goes up to $39,000. So, I mean, John, I personally have a question, which is to what extent are these decisions politically or financially motivated?
Yeah, I have an interesting story about, because I have friends who work at the NHS, the health service in Britain, and we had the same kind of questions about ventilators. And they said that, well, will we run out of ventilators? And then apparently this hospital in particular, they said it's okay. Most people who go on, by the time they get to a ventilator, they're pretty much dead anyway, so we're not going to run out. Which was, I mean, imagine if the press got a hold of that.
Wow. And well, see, that's an important thing, because if a person is going to die anyway, is there a hospital administrator out there who could morally justify in their own mind a manipulation of the circumstances around that patient's death in order to bring an additional $26,000 into the hospital that they might see as a resource that will help them help other patients? This could be the way that someone would justify something like that. The fact that the hospital administration, the official media spokespeople at Elmhurst Hospital have refused to answer these questions, it in and of itself raises other questions.
Yeah, I mean, the crucial point is that the difference between free countries, Western countries, and China is that we are supposed to have a system which is open to criticism, open to questioning, so that it can be improved and we can fix whatever problems we have. And so as soon as you start abusing that and saying that citizens don't have the right to criticize these institutions, especially at times like this, when we're basically being incredibly controlled by the government. I mean, in the United States, I suppose you at least have more constitutional protections, whereas for us, in the UK at least, the police have these emergency powers where they can effectively fine you an unlimited amount and imprison you just for being outside at the wrong time. And these police measures have been put in place for the next 2 years. And as far as I know, there's nothing in that law which says they'll be removed as soon as the coronavirus is gone. And this is on top of police abuse of powers that's happened since the early 2000s with the anti-terrorism laws.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people share your concern that at least in the United States, the advent of the Patriot Act has absolutely diminished our constitutional rights. And although it is very, sort of idealistic to consider that we have these constitutional protections, I'm not so sure that that's the case. We'd have to ask that guy in Philadelphia who got dragged off the SEPTA bus just the other day. Earlier this week, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo doubled the fine for breaking social distancing rules. So if you're standing 5.8 feet from a person, deliberate or not, they now have basically, I don't know if it's an order or a law or what, but the cops can charge you $1,000 and, you know, good luck arguing against that.
Well, I mean, this is why journalism is important. I mean, in a country like China, if you draw attention to government abuses or the covering up of epidemics, you can be imprisoned by the police. And for all the whatever abuses of power our governments might engage in, we at least have, at the moment, have the freedom to criticize them and draw attention to whatever they're doing. And if there's enough public outcry, it'll hopefully change. So I think I'd just like to sort of end with that.
Absolutely. I definitely appreciate your time today, John. I think you've done an excellent report, and I do hope that people will visit your YouTube channel. It is John Martin on YouTube, and I realize that's a little bit of a common name, so I will once again place the link to John's video into the comments, and I'll be sure to include it in the video description box. John, if you'd like to return to the show at some point, if you get any new information or new insights into Dr. Tedros, the World Health Organization, or any of these topics that we've been discussing, I would give you an open invitation to return. I think people really appreciate what you're doing. Your main website, once again, is roughestimate.org. And people can go there and they can read the article that you've written about the crimes of Dr. Tedros Adhanom. The man is indeed a diabolical character worthy of scrutiny, and he should be immediately removed from his position in the World Health Organization. Every order and piece of information that he has given or presided over needs heavy scrutiny, in my view. John Martin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a really great time.
Excellent, thank you. And I want to remind our viewers that Crowdsource the Truth cannot exist without your support. I'm doing this because I want to make sure that no outside economic influence can stop me from bringing the information that you want. You are the sponsor. So please visit subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth and become a sponsor. Even if you're watching the free broadcasts here on YouTube, Facebook, and Periscope, I want everybody to be aware that there is an active social engineering campaign ongoing right now, attempting to remove Crowdsource the Truth from YouTube and other social media channels. The best way you can help stop that is by becoming a sponsor on Subscribestar or Patreon. You're also going to enjoy access to a huge and constantly growing library of sponsor-exclusive content. I want to thank everybody for watching today. Stay safe and have a happy Easter, Passover, and weekend.